Why is it so hard to prosecute? Why hasn't anyone been brought to justice over this?
Because they didn't even begin to investigate the major lenders until the market had actually collapsed, which is completely contrary to what we did successfully in the savings and loan crisis, right? Even while the institutions were reporting they were the most profitable savings and loan in America, we knew they were frauds and we were moving to close them down. Here, the Justice Department, even though it very appropriately warned in 2004 that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, the FBI publicly warned in September 2004 that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, that if it was allowed to continue, it would produce a crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle, and that they were going to make sure that they didn't let that happen. So what goes wrong? First thing that goes wrong is after 9/11, the attacks, the Justice Department transfers 500 white-collar specialists from the FBI to national terrorism. And we can all understand that, but then the Bush administration refused to replace the missing 500 agents. So even today, again, as you say, this crisis is 1,000 times worse, perhaps, certainly 100 times worse than the savings and loan crisis. There are 1/5 as many FBI agents as worked the savings and loan crisis.
You talk about the Bush administration. Of course, there's that famous photograph of some of the regulators in 2003 who come to a press conference with a chainsaw suggesting that they're going to cut business loose from regulation, right?
Well, they succeeded. And in that picture, by the way, three of the other guys with pruning shears are
That's right.
They're the trade representatives. They're the lobbyists for the bankers. And everybody's grinning. The government's working together with the industry to destroy regulation. Well, we now know what happens when you destroy regulation. You get the biggest financial calamity of anybody under the age of 80.
But I can point you to statements by Larry Summers, who was then Bill Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury, or the other Clinton Secretary of the Treasury, Rubin. I can point you to suspects in both parties, right?
There were two really big things under the Clinton administration. One, they got rid of the law that came out of the real-world disasters of the Great Depression. We learned a lot of things in the Great Depression, and one is we had to separate what's called commercial banking from investment banking. That's the Glass-Steagall law. But we thought we were much smarter, supposedly, so we got rid of that law, and that was bipartisan. And the other thing is we passed a law because there was a very good regulator, Brooksley Born, that everybody should know about, probably doesn't. She tried to do the right thing to regulate one of these exotic derivatives that you're talking about. We call them CDS. And Summers, Rubin, and Phil Graham came together to say not only will we block this particular regulation, we will pass a law that says you can't regulate. And it's this type of derivative that is most involved in the AIG scandal. And AIG all by itself cost the same as the entire savings and loan debacle.
What did AIG contribute? What did they do wrong?
They made bad loans. Their type of loan was to sell a guarantee, right? And they charged a lot of fees up front, so they booked a lot of income, paid enormous bonuses. The bonuses we're thinking about now, they're much smaller than these bonuses that were also the product of accounting fraud. And they got very, very rich. But of course, then they had guaranteed this toxic waste, these liar's loans. Well, we've just gone through why those toxic waste, those liar's loans are going to have enormous losses. And so you have to pay the guarantee on those enormous losses, and you go bankrupt. Except that you don't in the modern world, because you come to the United States and the taxpayers play the fool under Secretary Geithner and under Secretary Paulson before him. We took $5 billion, for example, in U.S. taxpayer money and sent it to a huge Swiss bank called UBS at the same time that that bank was defrauding the taxpayers of America. And we were bringing a criminal case against them. We eventually get them to pay a $780 million fine, but wait, we gave them $5 billion. So the taxpayers of America paid the fine of a Swiss bank, And why are we bailing out somebody that is defrauding us?
And why?
How mad is this?
What is your explanation for why the bankers who created this mess are still calling the shots?
Well, that, especially after what's just happened at GM, it's scandalous.
Why are they firing the president of GM and not firing the head of all these banks that are involved?
There are two reasons. One, they're much closer to the bankers. These are people from the banking industry, and they have a lot more sympathy. In fact, they're outright hostile to auto workers, as you can see. They want to bash all of their contracts, but when they get to banking, they say, oh, contracts, sacred. But the other element of your question is, we don't want to change the bankers, because if we do, if we put honest people in who didn't cause the problem, their first job would be to find the scope of the problem. And that would destroy the cover-up. And the cover-up is... Sure, the cover-up.
It's a serious charge.
Of course.
Who's covering up?
Geithner is covering up, just like Paulson did before him. Geithner is publicly saying that it's going to take $2 trillion. A trillion is 1,000 billion. Right? 2 trillion taxpayer dollars to deal with this problem. But they're allowing all the banks to report that they're not only solvent, but fully capitalized. Both statements can't be true. It can't be that they need 2 trillion because they have massive losses and that they're fine. These are all people who have failed. Paulson failed, Geithner failed. They were all promoted because they failed, not because they had succeeded. Well, Geithner was one of our nation's top regulators during the entire subprime scandal that I've just described. He took absolutely no effective action. He gave no warning. He did nothing in response to the FBI warning that there was an epidemic of fraud. All this pig-in-the-poke stuff happened under him. So in his phrase about legacy assets, well, he's a failed legacy regulator.
But he denies that he was a regulator. Let me show you some of his testimony before Congress. Take a look at this.
I've never been a regulator, for better or worse, and I think you're right to say that we have to be very skeptical that regulation can solve all these problems. We have parts of our system which are overwhelmed by regulation. Overwhelmed by regulation. It wasn't the absence of regulation that was a problem. It was despite the presence of regulation, you got huge risks built up.
Well, he may be right that he never regulated, but his job was to regulate. That was his mission statement as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is responsible for regulating most of the largest bank holding companies in America. And he's completely wrong that we had too much regulation in some of these areas. I mean, he gives no details, obviously, but that's just plain wrong.
How is this happening? I mean, why is it happening?
Until you get the facts, it's harder to blow all this up. And, of course, the entire strategy is to keep people from getting the facts.
What facts?
The facts about how bad the condition of the banks is. So as long as I keep the old CEO who caused the problems, is he going to go vigorously around finding the problems? Finding the frauds?
You know,
taking away people's bonuses?
To hear you say this is unusual because you supported Barack Obama during the campaign last year, but you're seeming disillusioned now.
Well, certainly in the financial sphere, I am. I think, first, the policies are substantively bad. Second, I think they completely lack integrity. Third, they violate the rule of law. This is being done, just like Secretary Paulson did it, in violation of the law. We adopted a law after the savings and loan crisis called the Prompt Corrective Action Law. And it requires them to close these institutions, and they're refusing to obey the law.
In other words, they could have closed these banks without nationalizing them?
Well, you do a receivership. Ronald Reagan did receiverships. Nobody called it nationalization.
And that's a law?
That's the law.
So Paulson could have done this? Geithner could do this?
Not could, was mandated.
By the law?
By the law.
This law you're talking about?
Yes.
What's the reason they give for not doing it?
They ignore it. And nobody calls them on it.
Where's Congress? Where's the press?
Well, where's the Pecora investigation?
The what?
The Pecora investigation. The Great Depression, we said, hey, we have to learn the facts. What caused this disaster so that we can take steps like pass a Glass-Steagall law that will prevent future disasters? Where's our investigation? What would happen if after plane crashes we said, oh, we don't want to look in the past. We want to be forward-looking. Many people might have been, we don't want to pass blame. We want to move. No. We have a nonpartisan skilled inquiry we spend lots of money on, get really bright people, and we find out, to the best of our ability, what caused every single major plane crash in America. And because of that, aviation has an extraordinarily good safety record. We ought to follow the same policies in the financial sphere. We have to find out what caused the disasters, or we will keep reliving